Sorry about the interruption there. Famous syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Well, there's an argument. It is actually a syllogism, which is a particular form of argument, but that's really not important. It's an argument. It's a series of connected statements meant to establish an overall conclusion. The series of connected statements are these two here. The overall conclusion, which again is signaled by this word therefore, which doesn't have to be there, but sometimes helps if we put those kind of words in. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Socrates is mortal is the overall conclusion. So any series of statements which are meant to establish some kind of conclusion, that's what constitutes an argument. And in terms of logic and critical thinking and looking at things this way, the word argument is meant to comprehend all of this. That is, both these statements here, which are the support, and the conclusion, that those together are what we call an argument. Although, of course, in common speech, oftentimes by argument we mean just the support. But for the purposes of a class like this, and I think it's helpful to follow formal logic's definition of an argument as reasoning which contains both premises, which is what we're going to call these things here, and a conclusion here. So there is a very simple argument. That is an argument. And again, what is it? It's a series of connected statements meant to establish an overall conclusion, or just a series of statements meant to establish an overall conclusion, because the word connected there is rather vague, isn't it? These statements here, are the premises. This statement here is the conclusion. Every argument needs to have both premises and a conclusion. So if we look at that argument, we can begin to use the vocabulary we've established. It's an example of reasoning. And what is crucial, here's the argument. What is crucial is that an inference is made. Where is the inference made? Well, it's made at the end that Socrates is mortal on the basis of our assumptions that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man. It simply follows that Socrates is mortal. That is an inference that we can make on the basis of our premises. What does this little argument teach us? It teaches us a lot of things, the things we looked at so far, but also about the nature of premises. We have two here, right? That all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man. And those are premises, and those are what we might call absolute or pure premises, and in the sense that they are mere assumptions. And all I mean by that is that no attempt is made within the argument to argue for them. No support for them is given. No evidence for them is given. They are reasons to believe the conclusion, but no reasons are given to believe them. That is, we simply assume their truth. And the idea is that if they are true, then the conclusion must also be true. And that is, of course, a very simple thing. But it teaches us something important about arguments, and that is this, that arguments have to start somewhere. That is, that arguments can't be complete. They have to make assumptions. They have to start somewhere. You can't prove everything within an argument. If you tried to prove everything in an argument, or if you tried to prove all your premises, then your argument would be subject to an infinite regress. It would be an infinite argument. It would be a never-ending argument, because everything that you used to prove your premises would itself need to be proved, and that process would go on to infinity. So just because all of the premises of an argument are not themselves argued for does not make it a bad argument. Because all arguments have to start somewhere. The idea in an argument is that you start with premises that you know are true, or in real life that you strongly think are true, or are believed by you to be something which most people would admit are true, or something to that effect. The best arguments, I suppose, would begin with premises that are self-evident, that are obviously true, or that couldn't be wrong, and maybe we'll take a little look at that. So, arguments. Here's one. All arguments consist of at least one premise and a conclusion. You don't have to have a series of premises. An argument could have just two statements, one of which was a premise and one of which was a conclusion, but it would have to have at least one premise and it would have to have a conclusion to constitute an argument, because without that, there would be no reasoning, right? That is, if you didn't infer one thing on the basis of something else, then there'd be no reasoning, because that's what reasoning is. It's a step of reasoning in which let's just say, to infer something is to decide that one thing is true on the basis of something else believed to be true. So without that, without an inference being made, a step of reasoning, without a claim that one thing is true on the basis of something else that you believe is true, then you have no reasoning. And if you have no reasoning, you have no argument. Now, one of the things that we should talk about, probably in the next video, is kinds of arguments. Of course, there are all sorts of arguments, but in terms of their logical status, one thing to keep in mind is that there is a big difference between a deductive argument. A deductive argument and an inductive one. Both of them are arguments, and both of them, therefore, would need to fit in with our overall definition of argument. They would have to have inferences, they would have to contain reasonings, they would have to have premises and conclusions, but there's a big difference between a deductive argument and an inductive argument. I should say, first of all, that the vast majority of this course has to do with inductive arguments. It is not a class in formal logic. If it were, then it would almost probably wholly be concerned with deductive arguments. But this is a huge difference in arguments, kinds of arguments. And the difference is in the relation between the premises and the conclusion. If we look at this argument here, the syllogism, if we say that, if we just stipulate that our premises 1 and 2 are true, is it possible that the conclusion is false? That is, if we stipulate and assume that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man, is it possible for the conclusion Socrates is mortal to be false? The answer to that, classically at least, is no, it is not possible. Given the truth of the premises, the conclusion must be true. That's a deductive argument. An inductive argument, we'll pick this up next class, is basically any other type of argument where that statement about the premises and the conclusion is not true.